They forgot to close the garage door. By morning, 3 members of the same family were dead. The only witness? A 3-year-old girl, who somehow survived the monster inside. There is a particular kind of silence that doesn't belong in a home. Not the comfortable silence of a house settling into the night, not the quiet that falls after children drift off to sleep, not the stillness that comes when a long day finally lets go of you. This is a different kind of silence entirely. It is the silence that greets you when you walk through a door and something in the deepest part of your body knows, before your eyes have processed a single thing, before your brain has assembled one coherent thought, that everything you were expecting to find inside is simply no longer there. It is the silence that replaces people. And once you have heard it, truly heard it the way Connie Bennett heard it on the morning of January the 16th, 1984, it never fully leaves you. It lives in the space between your heartbeats for the rest of your life. This is the story of a family who went to sleep on a cold Colorado night feeling completely safe. A mother and a father. 2 little girls. A house they had worked for, a life they were building together, a birthday cake that still had wax melted into the frosting when the police arrived the next morning. 3 of them would never wake up. And one of them, a 3-year-old little girl who had done nothing more than fall asleep in her own bed, would spend the rest of her life carrying something that no child, no human being, should ever be asked to carry. What you are about to hear is not just a crime story. It is not just a cold case. It is the story of an ordinary family living an ordinary life in an ordinary suburb who crossed paths with something that had no business existing in their world. It is the story of a man who moved through the dark with patience and purpose and left almost nothing behind. It is the story of investigators who refused to let a shadow remain nameless. And it is the story of what happens to the people left standing when the worst possible thing occurs on what should have been one of the happiest nights of the year. This is the Bennett family. And this is what happened to them. If you are new here, welcome to Cold Case Beasts. Hit that subscribe button right now, tap the like button, and drop a comment below so the algorithm knows you are here. We go deeper than anyone on cases like this, and you do not want to miss a single second of what is coming. Now let's get into it. Aurora, Colorado in 1984 was not the kind of place where you expected anything terrible to happen. That is partly what made it so attractive to young families who were trying to build something real. It sat just east of Denver, close enough to feel connected to a city with energy and opportunity, far enough removed to feel like actual breathing room. The neighborhoods were new enough that the lawns were still finding themselves. The streets were quiet in the way that feels earned rather than empty. People moved there with box trucks and dining room sets and a very specific idea of what the next chapter of their lives was supposed to look like. Bruce Bennett was 27 years old. He had served in the United States Navy as a sonar analyst stationed at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and if you know anything about what a sonar analyst does, you know that it requires a particular kind of mind. A disciplined mind. A patient mind. A mind trained to detect what is hidden beneath the surface, to listen for the signals that most people would never even think to look for. He had spent his years of service doing exactly that, sitting in the focused quiet of his work, reading the invisible architecture of the ocean, looking for what didn't belong. When his service ended and he came back to Colorado, he carried that discipline with him like a second skin. He had come home with one picture in his head and it was not complicated. He wanted a stable job. He wanted a good home. He wanted a family he could protect. He was studying to become an air traffic controller, which tells you everything you need to know about the kind of person Bruce Bennett was. Air traffic control is not a career for people who get rattled. It is not a career for people who freeze under pressure or who need someone else to make the hard calls. It demands absolute focus, absolute accountability, and the ability to hold multiple moving pieces in your mind simultaneously without losing any of them. Bruce was sitting at his kitchen table most nights with textbooks spread out in front of him, eyes tired from a full day of work, hands still moving across the page. He was building toward something, and he knew it, and it kept him going. Deborah was 26. Her path to strength had been forged much earlier and much harder than most people her age had experienced. She had lost her mother young, and in the aftermath of that loss she had stepped into the role of caretaker for her younger siblings before she was old enough to fully understand what that meant. Life had handed her weight before she had finished growing, and she had accepted it, not because she had a choice, but because that was simply the kind of person she was. When her brother Larry introduced her to Bruce, there was something in her that recognized him. Something in her exhaled. She had been holding her breath for a long time without realizing it, and being around him felt like finally being allowed to set something down. They married young. They meant every single word of it. In 1983, the year before everything changed, Bruce and Deborah Bennett purchased their first home on East Center Drive in Aurora. The house was not large and it was not elaborate, but it was theirs in the way that a first home is theirs in a way that nothing that comes after ever quite replicates. There is something about the first time you close the door of a house and know that the mortgage has your name on it, that the walls belong to you, that no landlord can ask you to leave, that produces a feeling completely unlike any other. Bruce stood in the doorway of that house and the expression on his face said everything that needed to be said. No words came out, because none were adequate. They ran the family furniture business together. They were a team in the truest sense of the word. And at the center of everything they were building were their two daughters. Melissa was 7 years old, about to turn 8 in just a few days. The kind of child who fills every room she walks into without trying, without performing, simply by being herself. There is a specific quality to children like that, an aliveness that is almost tangible, a brightness that doesn't have an off switch. Her mother had already made the arrangements for her school birthday party, which was planned for later that week. Melissa had claimed it as her real birthday, the way children negotiate the calendar when they want to maximize the celebration. But on that Sunday evening, January the 15th, the family gathered at the house first. Just the people who loved her most. Just the warmth and the noise and the comfortable chaos of a family that genuinely wants to be together. Vanessa was 3 years old. The baby. Still fully inhabiting that age when the world is mostly made of magic and wonder and the sensation of being completely safe, because the adults around you have never given you a single reason to feel otherwise. She had no concept of danger. She had no reason to. Her world was her parents, her sister, her small bed, her family, and everything in it was exactly as it should be. That Sunday evening, the house on East Center Drive was alive in the specific way that only happens when the right people are in the same room at the same time. Connie Bennett, Bruce's mother, was there. His brothers Richard and Daniel had come. The gathering had the easy rhythm of a family that knows each other well enough not to have to perform, that can sit in the same space without filling every silence, that laughs at the same things without having to explain why they're funny. Someone had given Melissa an organ as her birthday gift. She sat down at it with the absolute confidence of a 7-year-old who has decided she is going to play this instrument, and she played it the way every child plays something new. Enthusiastically. Incorrectly. Completely without self-consciousness. The notes went wherever they wanted to go, which was mostly nowhere in particular, and it was wonderful. The adults in the room exchanged the kind of smile you exchange when a child is doing something objectively terrible and you have to admire them for it anyway. The birthday cake came out. The candles were lit, that small cluster of flames leaning in the warm air of the kitchen. Melissa leaned forward with all the gravity and ceremony that only a child turning 8 can bring to a birthday wish. The candlelight caught her face. She was glowing in the most literal sense of the word, the light finding the planes of her cheeks, her eyes bright with the particular joy of a child who is exactly where she wants to be, surrounded by exactly the right people, eating exactly the right cake. Everyone leaned in together. The laughter in that room was not the polite kind. It was not the performative kind that people do at gatherings when they are trying to signal that they are having a good time. It was the layered, comfortable, unhurried kind of laughter that only accumulates in rooms where people truly love each other, where the history between them is long enough and warm enough that they don't have to work for it. It just comes. It comes the way breathing comes. Then, the way all good evenings do, it slowly started to wind down. The natural rhythm of the night pulling everyone toward their separate lives. Coats came off chair backs and off the foot of the bed in the spare room. Hugs were exchanged at the door. That particular series of goodbyes that families do, where you say goodbye and then remember one more thing and say it, and then say goodbye again, and then someone makes one more joke on the way to the car. The cold January air reached inside every time the front door opened. One by one they filtered out into the night, breath visible in the cold, voices carrying in that particular way voices do when the temperature drops. But before he left, one of the uncles paused. He was already at the door, already halfway into his coat, already half committed to the cold, and he stopped. He looked back. He looked out toward the garage. The garage door was still standing wide open. The light from inside spilling out into the dark, illuminating a long pale rectangle of snow on the driveway. He said it out loud, because it seemed like the kind of thing worth saying. Make sure Bruce closes it before bed. The message was passed along the way messages get passed in families, casually, without urgency, because there was no urgency. Bruce nodded. He heard it. He registered it. And then the warmth of the house pulled him back inside, because the girls needed to be tucked in and the night was wrapping up and the garage door seemed like the kind of small thing that could be handled at any moment, later, in a minute, after. It didn't happen. Outside, the light from the open garage stretched across the snow. A long yellow rectangle cutting into the darkness of the January night. The neighborhood was quiet. The temperature was dropping. Inside, the house went dark room by room as the family settled in for the night. Bruce and Deborah in the master bedroom at the top of the stairs. Melissa in her room, probably still hearing that organ in some distant way, probably replaying the evening the way children replay good days as they fall asleep, holding on to the warmth of it. Vanessa in her small bed, 3 years old, wrapped in the absolute and total and complete sleep of a child who has never once been given a reason to be afraid of the dark. The house was silent. The garage door was still open. And outside, in the quiet of Aurora, Colorado, on the night of January the 15th, 1984, something was moving through the dark. A figure. Moving between the houses. Unhurried. Not rushing. Not emotional. Not frantic. Patient in the way that speaks to something practiced, something calculated, something that has done this before and knows from experience that speed is not the advantage. Patience is the advantage. He was scanning houses the way a person does when they are looking for something specific, not a particular address, not a particular family, but a particular kind of opportunity. An unlocked door. An open window. A gap in the armor of ordinary domestic life where an ordinary family had made one small, human, completely understandable mistake. He was not afraid of being seen. That is the detail that stays with you when you think about who this person was. A person who is afraid of being seen moves differently. They press close to fences. They flinch at headlights. They're always looking over their shoulder. This person moved through the neighborhood with a quality that could almost be described as ease, if ease were not such an ordinary word for something so profoundly wrong. He was simply looking. Reading the street the way Bruce, with his Navy training, might have read a sonar screen. Searching for the anomaly. Searching for the thing that didn't quite fit the pattern of the locked-up, battened-down, secure suburban night. And then he found it. The yellow rectangle in the snow. The open garage. The light still on inside, spilling out into the dark like a welcome, like an answer to a question nobody in that house knew they were asking. He did not force anything. He did not break anything. He did not have to. The door was open. All he had to do was walk through it. He stepped into the light. And his shadow swallowed it whole. What happened inside that house in the hours that followed is the part of this story that sits heaviest in the chest. The part that is hardest to hold without putting it down for a moment and breathing. 3 people who had gone to sleep in complete safety were gone before the sun came up. And the answers to what happened to them would not come easily, or quickly, or without decades of work by people who refuse to accept that a case like this simply goes unsolved. Monday morning. January the 16th, 1984. The phones at the family furniture store began ringing early. Bruce and Deborah had not come in. They had not called. They had not sent word through anyone. And the thing that made the people on the other end of those phones reach for the next phone immediately, almost without a pause, was that this had never happened before. Not once. Not a single time in the history of Bruce and Deborah Bennett showing up where they were supposed to show up. These were not people who forgot. These were not people who slept in. These were people who showed up, who called ahead if something changed, who were reliably where they said they were going to be. The calls to the house went unanswered. Every single one of them. Connie Bennett did not wait for an explanation. A mother does not need facts to know when something is wrong. The knowledge arrives before the evidence does. It comes from somewhere that does not have a name, somewhere below language, below thought, below the part of you that requires proof before it believes. She already knew before she picked up her keys. She knew in the way that you know when the phone rings at 3 in the morning. You know before you answer it. You know before the voice on the other end says a single word. Your body has already understood. She got in her car and she drove to East Center Drive. When she turned onto the street and looked toward the house, the garage door was still open. Exactly as it had been when the family drove away the night before, waving goodbyes through car windows, breath pluming in the cold. Still open. The light inside still on. Something about that sight, about the stubborn persistence of that open door through an entire January night, hit her in a way she could not have articulated. She walked toward the house. The yard was too quiet. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The silence reached for her before anything else did. Not the silence of an empty house, which has a particular quality, a waiting quality, a held quality. This was different. This was the silence that replaces people. The silence that falls when the people who make a house into a home are no longer there to fill it. It hit her in the chest before her eyes had fully adjusted, before they had even tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Something in her body understood what her mind was still refusing to process. She moved further inside, and she looked toward the foot of the stairs. Her brain refused. That is the only way to describe what happens to a person in that moment. Not shock exactly, though shock is part of it. The mind simply will not accept what the eyes are delivering. It searches desperately, frantically, for another explanation. Another interpretation. It tries to hold on to the version of reality that existed 10 seconds ago, 5 seconds ago, the version where everything is still fine, where there is still a normal explanation for all of this, where Bruce is upstairs and the girls are asleep and everything is going to be fine. The world does not wait for the mind to catch up. She ran. She screamed. She hit the neighbor's door with both fists, not knocking, not pressing the bell, but hammering, the desperate full-body percussion of a person whose entire world has just detonated in the space of a single moment. The neighbor opened the door and took one look at her face and understood that whatever had happened inside that house was beyond the reach of anything a neighbor could fix. The 911 call came in at 10:28 in the morning. By the time the first officers arrived on East Center Drive, Connie was standing on the snow-covered lawn, no longer screaming. The screaming had emptied out of her. What was left was something far more difficult to witness than screaming. That hollow, blank, absolute stillness of a person whose mind has retreated somewhere else, somewhere interior and unreachable, because being present in this moment is simply no longer possible. Her eyes were somewhere that was not the street, not the house, not any of the people moving around her. She had been inside. She had seen it. And now she would spend the rest of her life carrying the weight of having seen it. The officers moved through the garage and into the house. Bruce Bennett was at the foot of the stairs. The attack on him had been savage in a way that defies the ordinary language of violence. Severe blunt force trauma. The kind of force that does not stop when it has accomplished what it set out to do, the kind that keeps going, that exceeds any practical purpose, that speaks to something beyond the logic of the crime itself. Clumps of his hair were on the floor. They were on the wall. They were scattered up the staircase above him in a pattern that told its own story before anyone had to say a single word about what that pattern meant. But the blunt force trauma was not what had ended his life. Someone had stood over Bruce Bennett while he was still on that floor. While he was still breathing, still conscious, still fighting, still trying, with everything left in him, to survive. And that person had made a choice. A deliberate choice. A final one. Whatever instrument they had brought with them into that house, they had used it in a way that left no ambiguity whatsoever about the intent behind it. He had fought back. That much was undeniable. The bloodied handprints dragged up the banister said so clearly and without question. A man on the floor reaching up, gripping the wood, trying to pull himself upright. Trying to get to his feet. Trying to get to the top of the stairs, to the room where his wife was, to the room where his daughters were sleeping. The handprints tell you exactly where his mind was, even as his body was failing him. He was trying to get back to his family. He could not get there. The master bedroom was at the top of the stairs. Deborah was on the floor at the foot of the bed. Before the investigators had to look at her, the room itself told them what had happened. The dresser drawers had been yanked open and rifled through. Clothes pulled out and thrown. A wallet emptied onto the floor, cash taken, everything else left in a pile. Someone had moved through this room with speed and with purpose and with a carelessness that spoke to a particular kind of mentality, the mentality of someone who has assigned value to certain things and has no relationship whatsoever with the human cost of obtaining them. Deborah Bennett had been victimized in the most horrific way imaginable before her life was taken from her. A detective who had spent more than 2 full decades working homicide cases in Colorado, a man who had seen more than most people could bear to imagine, stood in the doorway of that bedroom and turned his back to it. He stood there for a long moment. His jaw was set tight. He looked at the wall instead of the room. He breathed. And then he turned back around and kept working, because that was the job, and the job was the only thing he could do for Deborah Bennett now. The last door was the girl's room. Investigators approach the last door of a scene like this with a particular quality of dread that is different from the dread of the earlier rooms. Because by the time you reach the last door, you already know enough to understand what you might find behind it. And knowing is almost worse than not knowing, because it means you approach without the small mercy of uncertainty. Melissa was on the floor between the 2 small twin beds. 7 years old. The scene had a quality to it that stilled the room in a way that even hardened investigators felt. A deliberateness. A calculation that made the already unbearable somehow worse. A child's blanket had been laid over her face. Her right hand was raised, positioned in a way that told you everything you needed to know about her final moments. She had fought. She had pushed back against whatever came at her in the darkness of that room. A 7-year-old girl with no frame of reference for what was happening, no preparation, no training, nothing except the fundamental human refusal to simply accept the thing that is coming for you. She had resisted with everything she had. It had not been enough. Nothing she could have done would have been enough. She was 7 years old. And that is the part of this story that is hardest to sit with, hardest to process, hardest to file away somewhere manageable, because there is no part of the mind that knows how to receive it and go on normally. The other twin bed was soaked through with blood. And then, in the heavy, suffocating silence of that room, one of the firefighters heard something. He stilled. He held his breath. He made himself go completely quiet, because whatever he had heard was so faint that the slightest sound from his own body might swallow it completely. There it was again. He moved toward the narrow gap between the bed frame and the wall. He crouched down low, getting as close to the floor as he could, bringing his eyes level with the space beneath the bed where the wall met the carpet. And there, pressed into that small dark space, curled into the corner like something instinctive and ancient and desperately human, was Vanessa. 3 years old. Barely breathing. Alive. The doctors at Children's Hospital in Denver used the word miracle when they spoke to the family. They were not using it loosely. They were not using it as a figure of speech or a professional nicety designed to soften a difficult situation. They used it because it was the most accurate word available. Vanessa had sustained injuries that left the entire trauma team in a state of stunned disbelief. She had lost so much blood that multiple units were required just to bring her to a point of stability. She was in a coma before the ambulance had even completed the journey to the hospital. The medical team worked through the night on a 3-year-old girl who had no idea, who had no capacity to understand, why any of this was happening to her. The outlook, the doctors told the family quietly, was uncertain. Connie Bennett sat in a hospital waiting room. The same woman who had stood on a snow-covered lawn 45 minutes ago unable to speak, the same woman who had hammered on her neighbor's door with both fists, the same woman who had found her son at the bottom of a staircase, sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights and prayed. She prayed for the one who was still breathing. For the baby. For Vanessa. She prayed with the specific, stripped-down intensity of a person who has already lost so much that they have nothing left to offer the universe except the raw fact of their need. And against everything, against every odd that had been stacked against her since the moment someone stepped through that open garage door, Vanessa held on. She held on through the night. She held on through the first morning. She held on through the days that followed, days in which the investigation outside the walls of the hospital was already beginning to reveal just how difficult it was going to be to find the person responsible for what had happened to her family. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now that says I am still here. Let us see who is truly following this story. Because what comes next, the investigation, the evidence, the decades of work that followed, and the moment the case finally broke open, is something you absolutely need to hear. The Aurora Police Department responded to East Center Drive with the full weight of what the scene demanded. This was not a routine call. There was nothing routine about it. 3 people were dead. A 4th was in critical condition at Children's Hospital. The house had been violated in every possible sense of the word. And the initial assessment of the scene made one thing painfully clear, almost immediately: whoever had done this was not going to be easy to find. The evidence was devastatingly limited. There was no clear point of forced entry, because there had been no need to force anything. The garage door had been open, and from the garage, access to the interior of the house was a simple matter. This told investigators something important about the nature of the crime. This was not a targeted attack. This was not someone who had planned to enter this specific house, who had stalked this specific family, who had chosen the Bennetts for a specific reason. This was opportunistic. This was someone moving through the neighborhood, reading the street, and finding the open door. Which meant that the victim selection was essentially random, which meant there was no relationship to exploit, no grudge to trace, no prior connection that might give investigators a thread to pull. Random violence is the hardest kind to solve. Because the whole architecture of criminal investigation is built on the premise of motive and connection. You look for who had a reason. You look for who had a relationship. You look for the scene where the victim's life and the killer's life intersected. When there is no intersection, when the selection was purely circumstantial, the investigation has to work backward from almost nothing. Almost nothing was exactly what they had. The processing of the scene was exhaustive. Every surface. Every drawer. Every piece of clothing on the floor. Every handprint on the banister. Investigators worked through it with the kind of methodical, sustained focus that a scene like that demands. They were looking for fingerprints. They were looking for hair, for fiber, for biological material, for anything the intruder might have left behind that would tell them who he was. They were looking for the ghost of the man who had walked through that garage door, and what they found was how thoroughly that ghost had managed to walk back out again. The prints they recovered were limited and in many cases degraded. The physical evidence from the scene was processed with the technology available in January of 1984, which was a fundamentally different world in terms of what forensic science could do and could not do. There was no DNA database. There was no CODIS. There was no routine genetic profiling of crime scene evidence. What investigators had in 1984 was what they could see, what they could lift, what they could compare against known reference samples, and what witnesses could tell them. The witnesses had almost nothing to offer. Nobody had seen the figure moving through the neighborhood that night. Or if they had seen him the way you see things at night that don't quite register as significant, a shape at the edge of your peripheral vision, someone walking, someone who looked like they belonged there, someone you filed under unremarkable and moved on from. Aurora was a neighborhood where people moved around at night. People walked dogs. People came home late. People sat in parked cars. A person moving through the street in the dark was not, on its own, a flag. He had counted on that. He had understood, whether through planning or through instinct, that ordinariness is the most effective disguise. Move normally. Move at a pace that does not draw the eye. Do not hurry. Hurrying is what gets people noticed. Hurrying is what makes a shape in the dark become a person that someone feels compelled to look at twice. He had not hurried. And so he had vanished back into the night the way he had emerged from it, without a name attached, without a face attached, without a single solid piece of evidence connecting him to the house on East Center Drive. The case was assigned. Investigators committed to it. In those early weeks and months following January 16, 1984, the Bennett family murders were a significant and active investigation. Every lead was pursued. Every possible connection was examined. People in the neighborhood were canvassed. The family's social circle was examined carefully. The furniture business was looked at. Every person who had been at that birthday party the evening before was interviewed thoroughly, not as suspects but as sources, as people who might have seen something, who might know something, who might without realizing it hold a small piece of the puzzle that the investigators needed. Nothing broke the case open. And as months passed without an arrest, without a named suspect, without a definitive piece of physical evidence pointing in a clear direction, the case began its slow transition from active investigation to the particular purgatory that cold cases occupy. Not closed, because there was no resolution to close it with. Not abandoned, because investigators do not formally abandon cases involving 3 murders. But diminished. Reduced by the accumulating weight of time and new cases and the simple arithmetic of a department with limited resources and an ever-growing number of crimes demanding attention. Vanessa recovered. That sentence sits differently than all the others in this story, because all the others in this story are about loss, and this one is about something that could have just as easily been another loss but was not. Vanessa survived. The 3-year-old girl who had been found barely breathing in the gap between the bed and the wall, who had been rushed to Children's Hospital in Denver, who had been in a coma, who the doctors had spoken about with carefully chosen words and uncertain prognosis, survived. She recovered physically with the resilience that children's bodies can sometimes produce, a resilience that is as astonishing as it is heartbreaking, because the physical recovery is only one part of what survival means. She was 3 years old when it happened. She was 3 years old when the family she had known was reduced to a grandmother and 2 uncles and a hole in the center of her world so large that it did not have edges she could see the other side of. She was 3 years old, which means she was young enough that the specific details of that night would not be accessible to her the way they would be accessible to an adult. But she was not young enough to be spared the consequences of it. She was not young enough to simply not know that her parents were gone. She was not young enough to be protected from the shape of what had happened, even if the specific contours of it remained mercifully blurry. She grew up knowing. She grew up in the aftermath. Connie Bennett raised Vanessa. The woman who had found her son's body at the bottom of a staircase, who had sat in a hospital waiting room and prayed for the baby who was still breathing, became the person who got Vanessa to school in the morning and helped with her homework in the evening and tried, with the particular courage of a grandmother who has already survived the unsurvivable, to give Vanessa the most normal life that could be constructed from the rubble of January 16, 1984. The investigation did not disappear. It would not be accurate to say that. Cases of this magnitude, cases involving the murders of 3 members of a single family, cases with a surviving victim, do not simply dissolve. They go underground. They live in filing cabinets and in the memories of the investigators who work them, and in the particular way that certain detectives, certain committed and stubborn and ethically driven detectives, carry a case with them even when it is no longer technically their assignment. The Bennett murders were that kind of case. The kind that follows you. The kind that waits for you in the quiet moments. There were detectives in Aurora who never let this one go entirely. Who would pull the file back out when something new came in, when a new technique became available, when someone said something in the course of some other investigation that sent a ripple through the memory of the Bennett case and made them wonder. The case remained in their peripheral vision, always there, never fully receding, never allowing itself to be comfortably classified as one of those cases that simply cannot be solved. And then, in the early 2000s, something changed. The change was not dramatic. It was not a witness stepping forward with a deathbed confession. It was not a piece of overlooked physical evidence suddenly materializing from somewhere unexpected. It was something that had been slowly building for years in forensic laboratories and law enforcement databases across the country. It was the expansion and the increasing sophistication of DNA analysis, and more specifically, the development of databases that allowed investigators to compare genetic material recovered from crime scenes against the growing catalog of profiles collected from people who had been arrested or convicted of crimes across the United States. The combined DNA index system, which investigators, and anyone who watches true crime regularly simply call CODIS, had been steadily growing since its national rollout in the late 1990s. And as the database grew, and as the forensic techniques for extracting and analyzing genetic material from old evidence continued to improve, cases that had seemed permanently cold began, in some instances, to thaw. The biological evidence from the Bennett crime scene had been preserved. This was not a given for a case from 1984. The preservation of biological evidence from cases that old is dependent on how that evidence was collected, how it was stored, and the decisions made by the people who handled it in the years and decades following the original investigation. In this case, the evidence had survived. And with the improved techniques of the early 2000s, investigators were able to extract a DNA profile from that evidence. A profile that had not existed in 1984. A profile that could now be compared against the millions of entries in the national database. The work of comparing that profile, of waiting for a result, of managing the hope that a result might finally come, is a particular kind of detective work that does not look like what people imagine detective work looks like. It is not dramatic. It is not fast. It is a different kind of patience from the patience of an active investigation, a longer patience, a patience measured in months rather than days. You submit the profile. You wait. You check. You wait more. You submit again if the database has grown. You keep going. The case was not the only one. In the years following the Bennett family murders, there had been other cases in Colorado. Other crimes with a similar signature, a similar profile of offender behavior, a similar quality of violence and opportunism that made investigators who studied patterns feel that familiar, uncomfortable prickling at the back of their awareness that says these things might be connected. Not certainty. Not proof. But the feeling that you develop after years of studying how people commit crimes, the feeling that a particular way of moving through a criminal act has a fingerprint as distinctive as the literal kind. Some of those other cases had their own evidence, their own physical material that had been preserved and submitted to the database. Some of them had their own profiles, their own genetic signatures waiting to be matched to a name. Cold cases are strange in the way that time works within them. From the outside, a cold case looks like stillness. It looks like nothing happening. It looks like a file sitting in a drawer while the world moves on and the family waits and the justice they need recedes further and further into some impossible distance. But inside the investigation, inside the work of the detectives who have not let go and the forensic scientists who are running and rerunning the analysis, time is doing something different. Time is accumulating evidence. Time is giving the database more entries. Time is improving the techniques. Time is carrying the case toward the moment when the thing that was always true, the truth that existed from the moment the crime was committed, finally becomes provable. Truth does not change. Only the ability to prove it changes. In 2012, 28 years after Melissa Bennett had leaned over a birthday cake and made a wish in the candlelight, the investigation into the murders of the Bennett family produced a match. A name. The DNA profile extracted from the evidence collected at the house on East Center Drive matched a profile in the national database. It matched a man named James Clyde Ware. A man who, at the time of the murders, had been living in the area. A man who had a criminal history that had eventually resulted in his profile being entered into the system. A man who had, on the night of January 15, 1984, moved through the dark streets of Aurora, found an open garage door, and walked through it. James Clyde Ware was already deceased by the time the match was made. He had died before the case could be formally closed with a living suspect, before a prosecution could be mounted, before a trial could be held, before a verdict could be rendered in a courtroom with a family present to hear it. This is one of the particular cruelties of cold case resolution, and it is more common than most people realize. The answer comes. The name is finally attached to the shadow. And the answer arrives too late for the kind of justice that involves handcuffs and a cell door. But the match meant something regardless. It meant that the Bennett family had an answer. It meant that the case that had lived in the filing cabinets and in the memories of Aurora investigators for nearly 3 decades had a resolution, even if that resolution did not come wrapped in the specific form that the family might have spent 28 years imagining it would come in. It meant that Vanessa, who had been 3 years old when she was pressed into the gap between the bed and the wall, who had grown up in the aftermath of that January night, who had carried the weight of what happened to her family through every year of her life, finally had a name. That name does not give back what was taken. Nothing gives back what was taken from the Bennett family on January 16, 1984. Not an arrest. Not a conviction. Not a match in a DNA database. Not a documentary. Not any number of words spoken about what happened. The 2 people who should have been there to watch Melissa turn 8, who should have been there for graduations and weddings and grandchildren and ordinary Tuesday evenings, are gone. Melissa, who should have had a full life ahead of her, who filled every room she walked into, who played that organ with such magnificent incompetence and such total joy, is gone. The birthday party that was supposed to happen later that week never happened. Vanessa's story is the one that continues, and it is a story worth saying something about, because it would be wrong to speak of her only as a victim, only as the 3-year-old who survived, only as a passive element in a tragedy that happened to her. She was 3 years old when she survived something that killed 3 other people. She went on to live a life. A real one. Not a symbolic one, not a cautionary one, not a life defined entirely by one night in January, though of course that night has always been part of her. She carried it. She grew up carrying it. She carried it into adulthood, into whatever life she built for herself after the house on East Center Drive. That kind of survival requires something that deserves its own word, and English does not quite have the right one. It is not merely resilience, because resilience sounds too simple for what it describes. It is the daily, ongoing, unglamorous, unobserved work of continuing to exist as a full human being in the presence of a wound that never fully heals. It is the work that Connie Bennett did, raising her granddaughter in the years after losing her son. It is the work that the detectives did, not letting the file gather dust, holding onto the case even when holding onto it meant holding onto something that offered no immediate reward. It is the work of not letting the worst thing that ever happened to you become the only thing that defines you, while also not pretending that it didn't happen, while also not diminishing it, while also somehow living. Vanessa held on that night in the gap between the bed and the wall. She held on in the ambulance, in the coma, in the hospital room. She held on through childhood. She held on through the years of growing up in the shadow of something most people will spend their entire lives never having to understand. She kept holding on. And the investigators who came to her with an answer in 2012, with a name after 28 years of waiting, gave her something that she had never been certain she would have. Not closure, because that word does not mean what people sometimes want it to mean, because you do not close something like this, you do not seal it and put it on a shelf and move past it. What they gave her was something different. They gave her the truth. They gave her the name of the person who stepped through the open garage door. They gave her the ability to say, "This is what happened, this is who did it, and the shadow has a face now, and the face has a name." That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything that an investigation can give to a family after 28 years. The truth. Finally. The truth that was always there, waiting in the evidence, waiting in the science that hadn't yet caught up with what the truth required, waiting for the moment when the technology and the database and the dedicated investigators who had not let go all arrived at the same point at the same time. The house on East Center Drive is still there. It is someone else's house now. Someone else's walls. Someone else's ordinary life being lived inside a structure that has no obligation to carry its history on its exterior, that looks from the outside like any other house on any other street in any other quiet suburb. The people who live there now may or may not know what happened within those walls. The street is the same street. The neighborhood has continued to grow and change around it. Aurora has changed around it. The world has changed entirely around it. But the story of what happened there on the night of January the 15th and the morning of January the 16th in 1984 does not change. It happened the way it happened. 3 people went to sleep and did not wake up. A 3-year-old girl was found barely breathing in a space too small to seem survivable. A man moved through the dark and left almost nothing behind except the truth of what he had done, a truth so durable that it survived 28 years of silence and eventually found its way back to the light. Bruce Bennett, 27 years old. A Navy veteran. A sonar analyst. A man who could detect what was hidden beneath the surface. A man who fought his way up a banister with both hands, bleeding, trying to get back to the top of the stairs. Deborah Bennett, 26 years old. A woman who had learned to carry weight before she was old enough to understand what it cost. A woman who had found in Bruce someone who made it possible to set some of that weight down. Melissa Bennett, 7 years old. 8 days away from turning 8. The girl who filled rooms. The girl who played a birthday organ with joyful incompetence. The girl who raised her hand against the dark and fought until she couldn't anymore. They deserved better than what happened to them. That sentence is inadequate, but it is true. They deserved the morning of January the 16th. They deserved the school birthday party later that week. They deserved all the ordinary mornings that followed, all the unremarkable evenings, all the years of a family living inside the life they were building together on East Center Drive in Aurora, Colorado. What they got instead is the reason this case exists. The reason investigators spent 28 years carrying it. The reason the evidence was preserved. The reason the database grew. The reason forensic science kept improving until it was good enough to do what it could not do in 1984. The reason we are here, talking about them, saying their names. Because they were real people. Not a case file. Not a statistic. Not a cautionary tale about garage doors left open on cold January nights. Real people, with a real life, inside a real house, on a real street in a suburb where people moved when they were ready to build something that would last. They deserve to last. And for Vanessa, who did last, who pressed herself into the smallest available space and held on through the night, through the coma, through the years, through the waiting, through the growing up, through the carrying of something no 3-year-old should ever have to carry and no adult should ever have to keep carrying, the case that bore her family's name has an answer now. The shadow has a name. The open garage door has a consequence that finally, after 28 years, came back to find the person who walked through it. It is not the ending anyone in that birthday room on the evening of January the 15th, 1984 could have imagined for this family. It is not the ending Bruce and Deborah dreamed of when they stood in the doorway of their first home and felt, in that particular wordless way, that they were finally somewhere safe. But it is the truth. And the truth, after 28 years, was the only thing left to give. Aurora, Colorado. January the 16th, 1984. The Bennett family. Say their names. And if this story meant something to you, if it stayed with you, if you found yourself holding your breath somewhere in the middle of it and had to remind yourself to exhale, then do something for Bruce, for Deborah, for Melissa, and for Vanessa right now. Hit the subscribe button on Cold Case Beasts so you never miss when we go deep on a case like this one. Like this video so that more people can find this story, because more people should know this family's name. And drop a comment below telling us what you think about this case, about the investigation, about the 28 years it took to find an answer, about what justice means when it arrives too late to take the form you always imagined it would take. We read every single comment. We are here for every single one of you who showed up for this story and stayed until the end. Cold Case Beasts. We do not let the cases go cold. We go all the way in, every single time. And we will see you in the next one.